Welcome to today's webinar, The Keys to an Engaging, Effective Presentation, No Matter How Brief, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Wendy Jackson. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Wendy Jackson and I am the Administrative Services Manager for the Legislative Reference Bureau in Wisconsin. I will be moderating our webinar today. Thank you to the National Conference of State Legislatures and NCSL's Legislative Staff Coordinating Committee for sponsoring this webinar. The LSCC serves in an advisory capacity to the NCSL Executive Committee, and one of its key purposes is promoting professional development opportunities for legislative staff, like this webinar. I serve as the chair of the Programs and Professional Development Subcommittee of the LSCC, so I'm particularly pleased that we could bring this program to you today. Whether you have an hour or 10 minutes, presenting complex information to colleagues and to policymakers in a concise manner is a challenge. Today we'll learn the steps to delivering an effective presentation and speaking like a pro. Our speaker today, Marianna Swallow, will share the keys to designing an impactful presentation, tips to revise and sharpen your talk, and strategies to make your delivery compelling. Marianna will take your questions at the end of this presentation, but you can type them into the chat box, which you will see in the lower left-hand corner of your screen during the presentation. Marianna Swallow has been in the training and speaking industry since 1997. She began her career as a software trainer in the 90s, moved on to teaching time management, and for the last 10 years has helped her clients improve their speaking and presentation skills. Marianna travels across the country to present at conferences year-round, and she performs her stories at storytelling events in Chicago, her hometown. When not telling stories or coaching clients, Marianna plays the ukulele. Please welcome Marianna Swallow.
Thank you, Wendy. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Keys to an Engaging, Effective Presentation. And what I'd like to do today is share some techniques with you to make your talks, presentations, whatever it may be, engaging and compelling and really having an impact on your audience, no matter how large or small they might be. Some of you might have seen the message I put in the chat box a few minutes ago. If you were at last year's summit in Chicago and attended my session, welcome back. Great to have you. You'll notice if you were at my talk last year, there's some similar concepts but some new concepts as well. If not, happy to have you here, and I'm happy to share this information with you. Now, you probably already know that today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it after today. I also make my slides available for my clients on slideshare.net. There's my username up in the middle there, MXSwallow. But you can also find them here on the media library, which is in your screen, or on your screen, I should say. If you look at your screen and you look just above the slides, there's a square with a right-pointing arrow in it. That is the media library. And what you'll see there are a copy of my slides. You're welcome to download those, and also a resource sheet. The resource sheet has a list of resources you can use beyond today. Some will reference some of the methods that I teach you, but then there are also some that you can use beyond today to try out your new skills or just watch some speaker videos and learn from them. So feel free to dig into the media library a little bit. So before we dig in, I want to kind of see where everyone's at right now with some of the concepts I'm going to talk about. And we're going to put a poll up in just a second. And here's what I'd like to know. You'll see your poll in the upper left-hand side of your screen. And what I want to know is, before you talk to someone or before you present some information, how much time do you spend thinking about what you want to say? Do you spend 30 to 60 seconds, 2 to 5 minutes? Or what do you mean, think about what I'm going to say? Please choose whichever is appropriate. And if you look at the poll box in the upper left-hand corner, you can see our responses are showing up in real time. Well, this is great. I love this. You are probably one of my few audiences who spends this much time. I want to thank the two people who were honest and said, what do you mean? Think about what I'm going to say. Thank you for your honesty. We appreciate that. The poll will be up for about a minute or so you can take a look at how your colleagues are responding. And this is kind of the cornerstone of what I'm going to share with you today, that thinking about what you're going to say and doing something with what you think about is the key. It's not just thinking about it in your head, because that's where a lot of speakers fall down, and we'll talk about that. Now, let me tell you a little bit about me so you know I know what I'm talking about here. As Wendy mentioned, I have been in the training industry since the 90s. I am a graduate of the Second City Conservatory. I have been teaching all sorts of topics since 1997. I started out in this field as a software trainer, and I don't like to tell people that because then they ask me about 3 seconds after they hear that if I can help with their computers, and the answer is no. And as mentioned by Wendy, I am a ukulele novice, and we'll leave it at that. Now, you might want to pay attention when you hear some interesting facts today because there might be a quiz later. We'll see. Now, before we jump into all these topics, a note about the words I'm going to use today. I will use different terms and different examples interchangeably. So I might say if you're speaking with the chief of staff, and if in your work you never talk with the chief of staff, but maybe you speak with legislators or other staff, think about how that will apply to you. I might say when you're presenting to a group, and maybe you don't present to a group, but maybe you work with small groups, or maybe you need to convey information one-on-one to a legislator. Think about what I'm sharing in that context. What I'm sharing with you today are concepts. And what I want you to think about as we work, I want you to think about how will I apply this in the work that I do. So think about your specific situations. If you have something like a presentation, a meeting, or a conference coming up, think about how you might apply this. I also really want to invite you to take notes. Whenever you hear a concept you want to remember, write it down. If you're on your computer and you prefer to type it down, then do that. But you'll see as I talk about these concepts that often making notes is not only a good way to make it stick, but that's the key to being well prepared. Now, my goal here today is to give you some methods and tools so that after today you can present data or any information you need to share in an understandable way and also convey your message concisely. This last part is so important, and I'm sure we've all been through this, and here's why. I bet all of us can think about somebody who has maybe given a speech or done a demonstration for us, and that person blathered on and on and on. And as you were sitting there, you were thinking, oh my gosh, what's the point? Or what am I doing here? You don't have to name names. You don't have to point out anyone specifically. But we want to make sure that when we have important information or a message to convey, that it's not getting lost in the blah, blah, blah. I also know that the nature of the work you do, everyone is pressed for time, so that makes it even more important that your messages need to be concise, to the point, and have the impact that you want them to have. So here's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to share with you 3 keys to an effective presentation. I'm going to share with you some elements to make your message stick with your listener. And in that component, what I'm really sharing with you are some principles and basis for adult learning. When we understand how adults learn and receive information, that will help us focus our message better. And then after we look at those 2 components, I want to give you some examples of what planning for a longer speech looks like compared to planning for a short speech. I will have some wrap-up activities. And then we have about 10 minutes or so allotted at the end of the call for your questions. And again, if you look in the chat box on the lower left-hand corner of your screen, Jessica has posted some instructions. You are welcome to type your questions into the chat box at any time during this presentation, and then they will be coordinated at the end, and Wendy will run our Q&A session, and I will answer your questions during that time we have at the end. So let's jump in here with our first section. Let's talk about the 3 keys to an effective presentation. And here's what they are: purpose, planning, and support. Let's start with your purpose. And I can't emphasize this strongly enough. Even if you are speaking to one person. Perhaps you're sharing some new data with a legislator, or perhaps you need to share some important new research with a chief of staff. You need to know your purpose going in, even if it's a quick, run by your desk and tell them what's going on conversation. Before you talk to a room full of people, an individual person, a meeting, make sure you know your purpose. Everything in your talk needs to support that purpose. And when you're focused on that, the fluff stays out. I'll give you one example. And this is the do not do example. As I said before, when we've all been in that situation where we're listening to someone blather on, and we're thinking, what am I doing here? What's the point? The reason that happens is because the person either A, did not prepare, or B, is unclear on his or her purpose. And I had a client once who once brought in a speaker for a lunchtime session, 1 hour slot, kind of like this webinar we're doing here today. And the speaker, even though they had given him the topic and said, oh, we want to know about X, he spent a half an hour talking about himself. And that's how long his quote-unquote introduction was. You can imagine the client wasn't too happy because he wasn't focused on the topic. He didn't have a clear purpose. He didn't give himself a clear purpose, and the client was very unhappy. So please, please, please don't be that guy. Now, I've got a little tool here for you, a little cheat sheet, if you will. So again, feel free to use the media library and download or print these slides. When I need to really focus my purpose before a talk, here's the fill in the blank I like to use. My goal is to blank, and I want my listener to blank. So what's your purpose there? And here's what it might look like in your world. Bringing up my next page. There we go. My goal is to inform the legislator of the financial benefits resulting from passage of this bill, and I want my listener to know that if this bill passes, state tax revenue will increase by $10 million. Good. Focused, straightforward, to the point. Now, I want to build on this, and I cannot emphasize this enough. No matter how good you are at your job, no matter how long you've been doing this, always plan, even if you've been doing this for years. And by planning, I mean making some kind of note, whether you scribble notes on a scrap piece of paper, whether you carry index cards around and scratch out your 3 ideas, whether you sit down with a Word document or PowerPoint and start typing out what you think you want to say. Even if it's going to be a very short conversation, you want to know your purpose and you want to have a plan going in. When we start with a plan, that makes us much stronger as speakers, but also by having that plan, even if it's just what we saw in the purpose statement, I want to share this and I want them to know this. When you have a plan preset ahead of time, your talk, your speech, your presentation, whatever it is, might not go the exact way you planned. However, by having that plan, kind of like a roadmap, it gives you something to go back to or to flex from when things change. So for instance, and we'll see this in my planning piece later, this has happened to most everyone I've ever worked with. If you're asked to give a half-hour talk on a topic, and then when you arrive, they let you know that the guy before you went over, so now you're down to 10 minutes. Oh my gosh, what do you do? Most people who don't plan freak out, and what they do is they keep their same contents in their head, and they go into their 10-minute slot and they just talk faster. And that's not going to be good for you or your audience. So always have some kind of plan, whether you type up a document in Word, grab some index cards. I do think index cards are important. You'll hear me come back to this, or just write yourself a note. But the key is make sure you do have something written down, sketched out somewhere for yourself. The other reason I keep hammering this, that you need to do this no matter how good you are at your job, no matter how long you've been here, there is a difference between knowledge and preparation. And this is another place where I see a lot of mistakes, or I see a lot of potentially good presentations fall down. So for instance, you might have someone who's worked at a company for 20 years. He's asked to give a speech on whatever topic, thinks to himself, oh, I've been here 20 years. I know this stuff like the back of my hand, gets up and wings it, and it is a meandering, wandering speech that just kind of doesn't do anybody any favors. Having a lot of knowledge does not mean you are prepared. So again, please, please, please take a minute, write something down, sketch it out, type it up in Word, type it up in PowerPoint, whatever your preference is. By the way, just want to point out how balanced I am. I have bipartisan slides. It's my lovely little joke every time I talk with NCSL. So now I'd like to do another poll. Again, please look up in your upper left-hand corner. How do you plan what you're going to say? How do you plan? Do you scribble some notes on paper? Do you make a PowerPoint using the inverted triangle format? Or am I kidding about this? Take a couple seconds to put in your answers. Most of you make some notes on paper. I love it. Good to know. Well, you're doing good. So hopefully what I have to share with you next will simply build on this for you. So I'm glad to see everyone does some kind of preparation. So 2 components of planning. We want to talk about your audience first, and then we're going to talk about planning your content. So let's start with your listeners. Again, this applies whether you're speaking to one person one-on-one or a room full of people at a conference. You can see some characteristics listed on my slide here. Some people like a lot of detail. Some people want to chit-chat about their kids or how their favorite sports team did. And as you look at these characteristics I've listed, you're probably identifying some of these. Maybe you know someone who fits one of these descriptions. Maybe one of these describes you. It's always good to know how someone likes to communicate. And here's the thing about our communication styles. I'm going to give you a tool for this in a little bit. The thing to know about communication is we communicate the way we prefer to be communicated to. Now this is very important because we tend to fall into our natural tendencies. We communicate the way we want to be communicated to. So if you like a lot of chit-chat, you very naturally will be very chit-chatty. However, that doesn't always land so well with someone who is maybe the detail person or the person who just wants you to get to the point. And I have some examples. And I'm hoping that some of you, if not all of you, watch the HBO show Veep, which, yes, is all about politics. And I've chosen a few characters who illustrate some of these characteristics. So on Veep, we have Richard Splett. He's the chief of staff to new Congressman Jonah Ryan. And what I love about Richard is no matter how horrible the situation is around him, they could be, trying to reorganize the government, and he worries about who wants what kind of cappuccino and who wants soy milk and who wants sugar. He is the very chit-chatty caretaker person, very smart. He knows a lot about politics, but he wants everyone to like him, and he wants to like everyone. That's Richard. Another guy from Veep I'd like to point out to you, who's also a fun character, is Kent Davidson, the former senior strategist. If you've ever seen the show, you know Kent is all about the numbers. That's all he cares about is data. And I love this quote from him. The number of people taken ill is orders of magnitude below statistical significance. Do people not understand basic non-parametric statistics? And what he was talking about there was people undercooking turkeys for Thanksgiving. If you've ever seen the show, you know Kent talks in facts and figures. And the third example I'd like to share with you is the person who likes no fluff whatsoever. He's the straight shooter guy, no BS, get to the point. And I love this episode when Selena, the vice president, wanted to give a bailout to her boyfriend's bank when another bank needed it more. And her chief of staff told her, ma'am, you cannot bail out your boyfriend's bank. That's going to look like you care more about your boyfriend than you do about the economy, normal people, and everything else you're supposed to care about. Now, I've given you some examples, but I'm going to break this into some even easier components for you to understand. However, before I do, you might notice that all the examples I gave from Veep were of male characters. I'm a big proponent of women in politics, and here's why I did not put any female characters on my slides. I combed through the Veep Wiki and IMDb and HBO's pages for the show, and the women have nothing that I can print, and I'm not kidding. They had some of the most not safe for work lines, and I wanted to keep my job, so I decided to leave those lines out of here. Okay, so these characteristics, the way we tend to communicate, there are 4 main styles of communication. We all have these in us. We all have some component in us. But as I talk through these, you'll probably recognize some in yourself, and you'll notice that we tend to favor in ourselves 1 or 2 of these styles over the others. And as I talk about these characteristics, you will probably also start to identify not just what's in yourself, but what you might notice in other people you communicate with. Now, the other thing I want to say about understanding the styles of communication is that when we understand these styles, if we know, for instance, if I know that my tendency is to be real chit-chatty and I identify that someone else might not be so chit-chatty, I'll know to focus my talk or get right to the point when I talk to this person. So let's take a look at these. And by the way, you can find this online as well, and I've put some of those resources in the resource sheet that's in the media library. The D component of DISC is representative of dominance. And your dominance communicator is someone who's very authoritative, takes authority whenever, even if they're not the ones to be in charge, quick thinker, quick decision maker, not a fan of chit-chat. They want to get right to the point. They want to know, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my district? What does this mean for my constituents? The second communication in DISC, or the second style, I should say, is the influencer. The influencer is someone who believes in relationships. They think feelings are important. They want to make sure that everyone feels okay with the decision before they move forward. These are the folks who do like to chit-chat. They want to hear how your kids did at soccer over the weekend, but they want to tell you how their kids did at soccer over the weekend. They like to engage other people, and they also like to be engaged. The third style of communication we want to look at is steadfastness, the S. The steadfast communicators are very thoughtful. They like to look at all their options, take in information, and think on it, maybe just for a minute, maybe for a day. They like to have some kind of visual or some printed material so that they know they're making the right decision before moving forward. And then our final style of communication is C, the conscientious communicator. The conscientious communicators are very analytical. They have high standards. Facts and figures are important. They want to know what the data tells us. Feelings, not so important. Accuracy, getting things right, and making the right decision are important to the C communicator. So again, take a look at these and notice if you can notice which ones are most like you. And then think about what are some situations where you might flex some of that. Do you have a legislator or a chief of staff you talk to who maybe you need to chit-chat with every now and then, and that's a way to engage them? Or is it someone who prefers data? You can always flex your style in the moment. So that's the part about thinking about your audience. You can plan for your audience, plan to modify your communication style and flex that a bit. Let's talk about planning for your content. And again, most of you said you do some kind of planning, so that's great. Any piece of content you put into your presentation or talk must support your purpose. If you have something that doesn't support your purpose, get rid of it. I gave you the example of the person who once gave a speech where his first half hour was talking about himself. Again, not in service of his purpose. So make sure that whatever content you put in is there to support your purpose. Again, I strongly suggest writing things down. You can even do something like write the purpose statement at the top of your sheet and then write down what are the few things you're going to talk about. This doesn't have to be a lengthy script where you're writing down every word you'll say, but maybe you have some new data, related to water treatment in your area. Just, sketch out data, these numbers, this data, etc. And when we make sure that our content supports our purpose, this will also make your speech, your talk, your presentation, whatever it is, concise. Because you're not putting any fluff in there. You're not adding anything that doesn't support your purpose for this talk. Now, of course, all of this is situational. So I want to invite you to be judicious and, kind of put your thinking caps on when you are looking at your content. Some of the data you present, I know, will be more complex than other. Or you might be presenting some data that's really complex. Again, go back to thinking about your audience. What does this legislator need to know? What is the impact? Is all of this data impacting her district? Or do we just need to share the 3 that matter to the area she's in? The other time you want to be judicious is, again, thinking about the situation. You might have some information that might not impact the person you're speaking with or the room you're speaking to as much as some other information. So, for example, let's say I live in the state of Illinois. Let's say in Illinois a new agriculture bill was passed. If I'm speaking to one of the legislators who works for, let's say, the north side of Chicago, that legislation is not going to impact that person's area as much as it will a legislator who oversees DeKalb, Illinois. So what of this information is relatable, and how much do I need to relate? How pertinent is this to my listener or listeners? So ask some questions when you're looking at that content, because it's something that, you can either cut it out of the speech, or maybe your legislator in DeKalb doesn't need to see everything about the agriculture legislation, but maybe you have an article you can refer them to later. Think about how can this best be presented and serve my audience. Okay, let's move on to our second key, the elements to make your message stick. And as I said before, these elements are based on principles of adult learning that will help you focus what you do and shape what you do so it lands with your audience. The first tool I'm going to give you is a structural tool, which will also help focus your message. And this is what we call in training the KDF. And what that stands for is, what do I want my listener to know, do, or feel? Your message might be just one of these. It might be all 3 of these. What do you want your listener to know, do, or feel? Sometimes you might just have 2 of these. So, for instance, let's say you are suggesting or recommending support for an upcoming bill. They might need to know what's behind this bill or know what the result will be, and then do. For the do, you might present the legislator with options. So what do I want my audience to know, do, or feel? By the way, the other scenario where we see know, do, feel, and where it's useful is for managers. So if any of you have staff you work with or manage, this is a great way for communicating with employees as well. Okay, my second element I want to share with you, this is known as the rule of 3s. Some of you may have heard this before. The rule of 3s shows up pretty much everywhere. It shows up in poetry, in fiction, in comedy. If any of you are fans of comedy, the next time you watch a stand-up special, notice if they mention a certain thing 3 times. That's usually the magic number. And there is something about things that come in groups of 3. It's a natural human tendency that we tend to like things in 3. So let me give you an example of what the rule of 3s look like. I have a couple of these. So here are some adult learning principles that I'm going to share with you. Number 1, adults have a short attention span. So what? Well, that means it's even more important that we focus our message. When I started in this industry in the 90s, the average adult attention span was 20 minutes. Nowadays, The new statistics tell us that adults have an average attention span of 7 minutes. So you can see it's even more important that we focus our message and plan for the audience so that it lands effectively with whoever is listening to us. Here's the second principle I'd like to share with you. Adults favor various senses to learn, and I'm a huge fan of this. If an adult is not an auditory learner, maybe you want to give them a printout of some of the data you are sharing with him or her. Tactile learners usually need to be engaged or moving around in order to absorb information. Maybe someone you work with is a tactile learner and they need to write things down. So think about how you can mix up your message. Can you include maybe some articles they can read, a handout they can look at later? Or should they be taking notes when you share information with them? Okay, here's a third adult learning principle. Adults in one sitting can usually remember 3 things. And remember, I said there might be a quiz later. Adults can usually remember 3 things. Now here's another example I'd like to give you of remembering 3 things. I recently read the State Legislature's magazine, March 2017, as I'm sure all of you did, cover to cover. And there was an article in the March issue titled, "What Staff Know?" And because I was preparing for this webinar today, I was really struck by the part of the article that addressed chiefs of staff. What do they want you to know? So here were my 3 takeaways from the What Staff Know article. Chiefs know how to find answers, but not how to read minds. So that should tell you something, maybe communicate with them a bit. Chiefs must handle all kinds of people and situations. And chiefs are time gymnasts with little downtime. I love this phrase, time gymnasts. I have a feeling most of you fall into that category. I know what you do is very busy and lots of times you are pressed for time. But here are 3 things that chiefs of staff want you to know. Here were my 3 takeaways from this article. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. Now, I just told you adults can usually remember 3 things, and a little later you'll hear me talk about using that rule of 3s when you prepare. But what if you are suddenly pressed for time? And this can show up in a variety of ways. Maybe you know that you need to corner your chief of staff and just talk to him for about a minute in the hallway. Or, and I have a feeling this has happened to some of you because I know this happened to many people that I met at last year's summit, what if you are asked to give a 30-minute speech and then you show up for the speech and it turns out that the guy ahead of you went over and now your 30-minute speech is now down to 10 minutes? As I said before, most people walk into that situation and just talk faster. I highly suggest you don't do that. Here's what I would like you to do for every talk you need to deliver, whether you think you're going to need this or not. Plan a salient sentence. And here's what I call, or here's how I define the salient sentence, the one key takeaway. So in other words, if you deliver your message today and your listener only remembers one thing, what should it be? And that's where you'll put your spotlight, is on your salient sentence. So remember the 3 takeaways I had from the What Staff Know article? I learned 3 things that chiefs of staff want us to know. Here would be my salient sentence. And here's what I would say if this were only one message or one takeaway I had from that article. I would say, keep it short when speaking to a chief of staff. She likely has no downtime and she needs to make quick decisions. Okay. Conveyed my point. Now let's move on to our third element and put this all together and see what this looks like. And in this portion here, I have given you some templates to use, and I'll explain a couple of the, well, I'm going to explain all of them, but the reason why I've made these templates I'll discuss in just a moment. Some of them are fill in the blank. Some are just examples of what you might say. So again, download these, use them. And well, let's go to the first one, and then I'm going to touch back to your purpose in a minute. Let's say you need to present a legislator with data and options. You might use a template something like this. Here's the problem, fill in the blank, Here is the data, fill in the blank, and here are the options. Here's where we can go from here. Here's an example of how you might present a result. And this is a result of something that's being proposed. So for instance, you might say to a legislator, supporting SB 164, which allows liquor sales on Sundays, will generate $3 billion in revenue for the state. So you might just simply present the result. But notice how succinct that is. Another example for presenting background and options, because maybe we don't have data, but maybe we have a background that is affecting what the legislator or member will do. And here's what it looks like. Here's the topic, talk about it. Here is the background, and here are the options. If you have time, you might insert something like a real-life example, or some real-life data, or perhaps something like a story from a trusted newspaper that might illustrate, if you need that supporting material. But if not, you can just bam, bam, bam through your 3 points. And here's one more example. Perhaps you need to inform a legislator of current status and what we're striving for. And this is an example I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with, the lead crisis in Flint. So the way you present the information might look like this. The current level of lead in the water is X. The current standard is Y. We're not up to the current standard. Here's what you need to consider. Share your data there. And if we don't change it, the impact will be Q. Now, the reason why I give these templates, these examples, this kind of fill in the blank, is what I've noticed over the years is when people have data, they usually don't share it with their audience in a way that explains what the data means or what story it tells. What I've historically seen are people who will run some numbers and they'll come in with an Excel spreadsheet, or they might have converted the numbers from a spreadsheet into something like a pie chart or a graph, and they'll put the graph up on the screen or give everyone a handout, and then say something like, okay, here are the numbers from what we saw in this district comprising 60657 and 60640. Okay, moving on. And they don't say what it means or why it's important. So a good question to always ask yourself is, what is important and why? And is this important to your audience? You might even frame that question as, what is important to my audience and why? Let's keep going, and let's talk about preparation a little bit. And what I've given you here is an overview of how you might prepare for a longer speech versus a shorter speech. On the left-hand side, you can see what I've got for a 30-minute speech, and this is an outline I would craft. Something like, welcoming everyone, sharing the purpose, I'm here to educate you on SB 123. I might share a story from a constituent that illustrates the concern or the issue we're dealing with. Notice under there I've got why this matters and the future impact. That's where you would ask that question, what is important and why? And then I would outline my 3 most important points. And I want to point out here, this is how I counsel all my clients to arrange this. First most important point, then your second, then your third. We always have to remember that there's a possibility that we might get cut off, our speech time might get cut in half, so you always want to make sure your most important point, that salient sentence, goes first so your audience gets it. Beyond your points, you can either present options, ask for a call to action. You can also take questions and then ask for any commitment or follow-up. And that's great if we have a half an hour. If you have 10 minutes or less, here's what I suggest for preparation. You can see this in the right-hand column. With a very short speech, I would put what I call the big bang up front. What is the immediate impact? What are the results? What are we working with here? That's your what's important and why. Then say your most important point using your salient sentence, and then you can ask for questions or discuss it further with the person you are speaking to or your room, time permitting. But I like having that kind of quick bam, bam, bam when you have 10 minutes or less. I did mention before, and quite a few of you said you do prepare by scribbling down notes. I highly recommend that you always have something on you or in your binder, briefcase, bag, whatever you carry with you. Some people like to make quick notes on index cards. I myself use Field Notes. It's a brand of notebook. It's a very small notebook. It is always in my bag with me with a pen. But again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough. Don't just say to yourself, okay, and think about it in your head. Okay, I'm going to say this. I'm going to talk about SB 123, and then I'm going to tell them about the impact. You want to make sure you have it written down somewhere, kind of like your roadmap. Okay, I did say before that there would be a quiz, so if someone could please, anyone can jump on this, go ahead and put your answers into the chat box. Let's see how well you were paying attention and if my rules of 3 worked. So first question, what's one thing you remember about me from our intro? I'll give you a second to type in. Oh, hurrah, awesome, that I play the ukulele, yes. Oh, I love that. Oh, and I used to be a software trainer, yes, thank you. Oh, look at that. I'm a ukulele novice, yes. Awesome. Second City, someone, Adam, Ms. or Mr. Adams, I don't know who that is, said Second City. Quite a few of you said Second City. Thank you. Yes. Oh, look at that. You guys are good. Thank you for remembering that. And by the way, I was asked by the folks who put this webinar together to bring my ukulele and play it, but I promised I would not torture you, so I left the ukulele at home. Okay, let's see what else you remembered. What's one thing that the Chiefs of Staff want you to know? No cheating and looking at your state legislature's magazine. Press for time, time gymnast. No downtime, time gymnast. They are, oh yes, you all got it, yes. Press for time. That they can't read minds, yes. Oh, these are great. Excellent. I think all of your Chiefs of Staff will be very happy. Ah, yes. They know where to find answers, but they can't read your minds. Very good. Okay. I think that's great. We got to see the rule of 3 in there. Well, what I'd like to do now is turn this back over to Wendy, who will be coordinating and moderating the questions, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions for you. And Wendy or Tricia or Pam may have some as well. So I'm going to let this be your time to ask questions here.
Thank you, Marianna. As Marianna said, please type your questions into the chat box. I know it is Friday. I know many of you on this call, and you're being a bit quiet. And while we're waiting for some questions, I just want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded. We are being recorded right now. And you can go to ncsl.org to find it. And also, as you might recall, Marianna shared her slideshare.net site for you to look at the slides. I do have one question. Marianna, is it better to just talk, or are PowerPoints, do you advise PowerPoints as well?
Wendy, say the first part, to just talk. Is that what you said?
Right, with or without PowerPoint slides.
Well, it really depends on the situation. If you are going to be in a room full of people, I highly recommend PowerPoint, and here's why. PowerPoint, it is there for the audience. It's good for your visual learners. However, it's also really there for the presenter, because if you get taken off track or a discussion breaks out that you think is worthy of some time, but then you need to go back, you're not mentally scanning your brain going, oh my gosh, where was I? Now, for something informal, a one-on-one, maybe you're just stopping with a legislator in the hall and saying, hey, we need to talk about this issue. Obviously, you won't have PowerPoint, but it's good to kind of, at least in your mind, have okay, here's what I want to talk about, 1, 2, 3. But for something more formal, where you have a room full of people, and maybe even in some meeting settings, I highly recommend PowerPoint.
Here's another great question. Do you think about cultural differences when you're communicating a persuasive argument?
The short answer is yes. However, I'm wondering if whoever submitted that question can give some clarification, and here's why I'm asking. in the United States, we have cultural differences between Chicago and, let's say, somebody in Nashville. But then we also have folks from other countries who move here for work, and maybe I need to communicate cross-culturally in a work setting. So the short answer is yes. However, it's also very unrealistic to expect a speaker to flex to 57 different people in the audience. So, for instance, I might have one guy from Poland over here, and then 5 people from the Deep South in another part of my audience. I think it's a good way. I think initially it's a good way to start by making sure everyone's starting from the same place. But you absolutely do take cultural considerations into account before you present, but at the same time, you want to be realistic and know that, a speaker can't flex to me, let's say 25 different differences in the room. So that's where it's safer to kind of go middle of the road. Okay, and the person who asked the question did provide some clarification. Oh, good. This person says that his or her representative represents a very diverse district by age, race, gender, or religious affiliation and political background, just to add the context for you. And that's a great example. Here she said, thank you for the answer. Oh, yes, great. Thank you so much. So, yes, if you know what you're going into, for instance, if I'm a Generation Xer, if I know I'm going to be talking to a group of millennials for the day, I will absolutely make some concessions or flex what I do. But I might start, don't forget that as the speaker, you have every right to kind of set the stage because it is your stage. So I might ask them to put the phones aside. But I also have to kind of allow that if I make some kind of way off cultural reference, like if I, try and make some joke about Duran Duran, they are not going to get it. So you do need to think about your audience and what's going to land with them. If, you're speaking to a particularly religious audience, you might just leave religion out of the discussion altogether, unless obviously it involves something like a church or place of worship. But you want to, just kind of have your antenna up and go, okay, who am I speaking to here? And what should I maybe avoid or do? Another example, I know a consultant who, quite frankly, and I hope I'm not crossing any lines talking to NCSL about this, because I'm crossing the church and state line a little bit, but I know a consultant who happens to be an atheist who consults with religious not-for-profits because the religious aspect of either of their lives has nothing to do with the work that they're doing. So she just leaves that part of the equation out whenever she goes to meet and consult with her clients. So it's again, being aware of your audience. And, a little humility, too, also doesn't hurt. I have spoken to groups of millennials, and I've kind of made a joke like, well, I'm old, and I didn't grow up with Pokemon or whatever. And they laugh with me, and then we, move on from there. Here's another question. Do you have recommendations for speaking to legislators in the public, being put on the spot? When you're in public, do you have a recommendation for being put on the spot to answer questions? Sure, meaning that you are the speaker and you're with a legislator and they put you on the spot. So, for instance, something like, Wendy, if I'm a legislator and I'm sitting next to you in a meeting and I say something like, Wendy, you visited Chicago last week. Tell us what legislation is going on. So something like that? Yes. Okay. Yes. So there's a couple of ways I like to play this. If you actually can get a couple of seconds, like 30 seconds to a minute to yourself, I said a minute ago, always have index cards with you or notebook. In those instances, for instance, if I'm at my desk and someone says, hey, I need you in this meeting to talk about such and such, I'll say, give me 1 minute, I'll be there. And I sketch some notes down on my notebook thinking, okay, what's that topic? What are the 3 things I want to say? 1, 2, 3, never more than 3. And then I go in and then I give my little speech or spiel. If you are truly put on the spot, it's interesting. I think most of us think that when we are put on the spot, that automatically means you have to answer. And clearly they want an answer from you, which is why they asked. But you could also preface it by saying something like, oh, wow, Thank you, Wendy. I wasn't expected to talk about the Chicago legislation today. Off the top of my head, I do remember that they talked about funding for schools and funding for homeless shelters, but anything more detailed than that, I need to go back to my desk. I can compile some numbers and email them to you later today. You know, there's nothing wrong with being honest and saying, you know, I'm not entirely prepared. You don't want to make a big deal out of it to make yourself look like you're bumbling or saying, you know, oh my gosh, I have no idea. But, you know, your speaker, or excuse me, your audience has to understand that if you're kind of called on the carpet, if you weren't told to show up to the meeting with notes about what the people in Chicago talked about around legislation, you can only work with what you've got. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm not sure, I don't have that answer in front of me, let me get back to you.
I have a couple of questions about how to handle interruptions. Do you have any tips for deflecting interruptions to avoid being taken off track of your message? Or how do you keep someone in the audience from constantly interrupting with questions?
Sure. Kick them out of the room. No, I'm kidding. That was a joke, everyone. That was a joke. No, so two things. Again, when it's your turn to speak, even if you're part of a meeting or even if it's just you, I highly recommend that you set the stage. If you remember at the top of this call, both Wendy and myself did say, this is what we're going to do, this is what I'm going to talk about, and then we're taking questions at the end. So even if you only have the floor for 10 minutes of, let's say, a 1-hour meeting, you can say, when you get up to say your piece, I have a lot of information. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I would like to get through this, and I can take questions when I'm done. So that's the first thing, is to kind of preempt it and set aside a Q&A time. If someone interrupts you and says, you know, well, what about such and such, you can say, I can get to that at the end. Please just let me complete my information here. And if they interrupt you again or multiple people do, you know, the other factor that's at play is that what you have to share, the information you have, their question might already be answered in there. So you can remind them of that. You know, I'm coming up to that point, or that will be addressed later by my colleague. But it's okay it's absolutely okay to say, if you can just let me get through my material, I can take questions when I'm finished. And I realize, like someone said in the chat box, but it's a public meeting, I realize that there are some audiences that even when you say, I'm taking questions at the end, there are some folks who just believe the rules don't apply to them. And it's, but my question's important. And if you stand your ground and just keep repeating, you know, in a polite way, with a smile on your face, or, you know, half a smile, you can say, you know, I will get to that at the end. After they hear that enough times, if they have to hear it more than once, they usually comply. I've never had an audience member who I've, you know, asked to please wait. I've never had anyone become belligerent, and not just me, but other clients I've worked with. So okay. Those are my two suggestions.
Great, and we have a few minutes for a couple more questions. Say a person regularly gives 20-minute presentations that are well rehearsed. Mm-hmm. How do you look less dependent on a script when you still need to stick to it because other people have helped you craft the presentation?
That's interesting. So it sounds like the person asking the question is saying you have to stick to the script because other people helped craft it. My advice would be to stick to it as loosely as possible, and here's why. When I work with my clients one-on-one, I always tell them, and this is true for pretty much any speech, except, you know, for instance, when President Obama had the teleprompter, we know those speeches are loaded up for them, as they are on Veep as well. But when you craft a presentation, even if other people have helped you, you don't, in a perfect situation, you don't want there to be a script. You want to know what your points are and how to move from point to point, and here's why. If you memorize a script, and then during the meeting or presentation, someone in the audience takes you off track, or the building loses power and then 10 minutes later it comes back on, if anything throws you off, you will find yourself so flummoxed by having to stay on script. So my suggestion, if you do have a script that other people helped craft, you know, usually when you give some kind of acknowledgement to the people who helped you write this, you know, keep every other line, or keep a sentence from person A and then a couple sentences from person B, because you want to make sure that you still have the flexibility that, you know, even if you plan this and practice this 20-minute speech, if you get cut down to 10 minutes one day, there is no way you can give that full 20-minute speech. So I would find a way to maybe paraphrase so that you're not completely destroying the material they gave you, but you're still honoring it.
Great. And thank you for your questions. I'm afraid that we don't have time to hit them all, but what NCSL will do is we'll go back to the questions and work with Marianna to get some answers for you. So once again, thank you so much. And thank you, Marianna, for this excellent presentation. I kind of want to go back and redo my opening remarks now. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us today. Again, remember that the webinar has been recorded, so you can find it again or the slides. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. We disconnect your lines at this time, and have a great day.